The terrifying truth about Aizen is that he's a perfectly rational villain. While he's mostly known for his insane genius or menacing aura, nobody really talks about how Aizen is a humanist character. In other words, while he may be an overpowered evil genius, his motivation has always been alarmingly relatable, which is exactly why I'd like to analyze some of his best moments in Bleach that everyone tends to overlook, and explain exactly what it is that makes him one of the best villains of all time. Now, obviously, part of what makes Aizen such a great villain is the fact that he's an evil genius. And not just any evil genius. He's basically the evil genius. I mean, list your top 10 evil geniuses in anime, and Aizen's gonna be on that list every time. It's precisely why anytime someone crafts a sinister plan, they break out the old "according to Keikaku" meme. Aizen isn't just smart, he's a genius among geniuses. Like, every time you think you know how smart Aizen is, he shows you another example of how he's practically masterminded everything in Bleach. He planned the entire conflict during Soul Society, and made an escape so that nobody could touch him. He made a scheme to craft his own key to the Soul King's palace, unlike Yu Hawk, who was like, yeah, we'll just use the back door, I guess. And he came up with an entire contingency plan to beat the strongest living Soul Reaper without breaking a sweat. Like, every time you think Aizen might lose, he's already got like 20 contingency plans. Regardless of his morals, the fact of the matter is that Aizen is the biggest schemer in Bleach. Nobody can outthink Aizen. But let's be real, the whole evil genius thing isn't exactly original. DC and Marvel have been doing it since what, like the 40s? It's in like every other Disney movie. And it's the most basic villain archetype. So what exactly makes Aizen better than, say, a Dr. Eggman, or a Vandal Savage, or even a Brainiac? Or even one of my personal favorites. How is it that he avoids the typical cliches and stands out as one of the best villains of all time? Well, it's like I said before. Unlike your typical evil genius who's primarily obsessed with knowledge or world domination, Aizen's goals are much more down to earth. Or rather, he wants to bring the gods down to earth, which is exactly what makes him relatable. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, while there are many examples of Aizen explaining his motivation, the one everyone should remember is when he's defeated by Ichigo. He's finally being imprisoned, and when confronted by Urahara, the man who rivals his intelligence, he declares his hatred for him. "I despise you. With a mind as brilliant as yours, why do you accept the status quo? Why? How can you keep obeying that thing?" And when Urahara claims that they need the Soul King to hold the world together, Aizen keeps going. That's the logic of a loser. A winner doesn't ask how the world is, but how it should be. While it's been referenced more than a few times prior to this scene, this exchange spells out in black and white Aizen's entire motivation. Namely that he feels the system of Soul Society being dominated by the Soul King is unjust, and wants to change that corrupt system. And in that sense, Aizen is a textbook humanist. He doesn't revere gods. He doesn't believe in governments before people. He believes in the agency of the individual, that no person should be limited by the status quo. It's ironic because his final words here are basically identical to the scientist who raises the character Winston in Overwatch.
Always remember, never accept the world as it appears to be. Dare to see it for what it could be.
It's funny because in one scene these words make for a super uplifting moment, yet in our context of Bleach, they're seen as the pathetic rationalization of the big bad who failed to complete his evil plans. But both of these statements are humanistic. Notice how in the Overwatch scene they're literally in outer space, and yet this source of optimism comes from Earth. It's this idea that we don't have to look up to the gods for salvation. We as individuals can create the world that we want to live in. And that's exactly what Aizen does. Aizen is a scientist at heart, which is why he's so offended by Urahara's complacency. For everything he does, for all of his dastardly deeds, Aizen's motivation is humanistic at heart. He wanted to challenge the gods and create a new world where the autonomy of individuals had free reign. So yes, Aizen is a lot like your evil genius characters like, say, Vandal Savage, because he desires power and uses his genius to take that power. But he's also much more than that. He doesn't desire power purely out of greed. His desire for power is a manifestation of his deeper resentment for the Soul King and the predetermined order of society. He values power just as much as he values individual autonomy. And yet, if you know Aizen, you know this sounds somewhat out of character. Because on the one hand, he preaches challenging the status quo and humanism, but on the other hand, his actions seem to contradict that. His schemes to manipulate everyone would seem to suggest he believes the opposite, that not only does he not value individuals, but he thinks nothing of their roles as individuals. Plus, he's far from your typical humanitarian. It's not like he's reading to kids at the library and handing out lunches at the local Soul Society shelter. The dude masterminded a coup, faked his own death, murdered the entire council, forced all of Hueco Mundo to follow him, and slaughters anyone who tries to stand in his way. So he might talk the talk, but on paper, Aizen has quite the rap sheet. And this is more or less the fundamental issue that Shinji points out. He confronts Aizen, who claims that trust is a form of reliance and thus cowardice. Naturally, Shinji points out that it's ironic for Aizen to say that when he so regularly uses other people by encouraging them to trust him. But pay attention to what Aizen says next, because in a way, this exchange is even more important than the one from before. Aizen says, "I've never asked my people to trust me. I constantly tell them not to trust anybody, including me. All beings trust their superiors. They can't survive if they don't follow blindly. Those who are trusted pass their burden to those above them. That is how all kings are created and how all gods are born." Here, there's two things to take away. On the surface, Aizen is flexing on Shinji, saying that he doesn't rely on his minions. Rather, they, in their insecurity, turn to him out of reliance for survival. In other words, he is so superior to everyone else that they are naturally forced to rely on him without him making them do it, hence why he implies that he has become a god. On the other hand, this exchange reveals why it is he resents the Soul King so much. Because on the one hand, this is an aura scene where Aizen flexes by calling himself a god. But notice how he doesn't say this out of excitement or passion. His speech here carries a tone of disgust, which is why he refers to the people who rely on him as cowards. Now, take this speech and apply it to the context of the Soul King. Suddenly, it makes perfect sense. Aizen doesn't just hate the Soul King because he's more powerful. Rather, it's because he despises the system in which everyone is complicit in the status quo simply because they fear what would happen without the protection of the Soul King. And that right there is why this scene is so important, because now you get a complete understanding of why he calls everyone cowards, why he despises Urahara, and more importantly, why he claims to want to see the world for what it should be. Because as evil and menacing as he is, Aizen's motivation is fundamentally humanistic. He seeks to create a world where individuals trust in themselves first and don't perpetuate a society where everyone blindly gives into the power of a single entity. That thing, as he calls it. And it's this goal of his that also leads to Aizen's insane charisma as a villain. Because let's be honest, Aizen's motivations, his speeches, are pretty rational, but there are plenty of rational villains, like Pain, for example. Pain is probably the best example of the so-called villain who was right, and yet Pain isn't exactly charismatic. As a matter of fact, Pain couldn't be any more different from Aizen. Pain aims to create a new world order by establishing himself as a god and placing everyone in a false sense of peace and security. Quite literally the exact kind of status quo that Aizen explicitly calls out and despises. The difference is that Pain is a rational villain, but he isn't charismatic because he isn't motivated by his own ambition. His plans are actually the result of having given up on his dreams of wanting to create peace while he was still just Nagato. But with Aizen, his rational humanism stems from his own ambitions. Aizen is so smart that he's able to see a world beyond the status quo. To him, he isn't confident. He believes in his plans and abilities because he knows as a matter of fact that he is smarter and stronger than the people who stand in his way. And this is what makes him so much more charismatic as a character. Aizen's charisma is a manifestation of both his personal ambitions and his ability to carry out those ambitions. For example, part of why he's able to flex on Shinji is because he's able to state as a matter of fact just how superior he is. He literally tells Shinji, "I'm so strong that even when I tell people not to trust me, they still come crawling to serve me." He also does this at the end of Soul Society. Ukitake accuses Aizen of falling, but Aizen tells Ukitake not to kid himself. "No one ever stood atop the heavens before. Not you, or I, or the gods. But the unbearable vacancy of heaven's throne ends now. From now on, I will stand at the top." Again, you have this combination of Aizen flexing on everyone by saying that he's a god. But you also have this rational side to it where he's basically saying that God is dead, and that he will create a new world where power isn't founded on the cowardice of the status quo. And it's these conflicting qualities that motivate Aizen's evil deeds. As we've laid out, Aizen talks as though he is a humanist, that above all else he seeks a world where people don't rely on the power of others. And yet through his actions of murder, scheming, and betrayal, he constantly seems to contradict himself. His motivation sounds rational, but time and time again he speaks of godhood and power. So why is it that Aizen aspires to these things even though they seem to contradict his beliefs? Without spoiling the anime ending, Aizen gives one last speech in chapter 686. He says, "In a world without the fear of death, people will not search for hope. People will persist simply by being alive. But persistence while fending off fear is something entirely different. That is why people have a name for it. They call it courage." Here, while speaking to the courage of Ichigo, Aizen also reveals the motivation behind his evil deeds. He believes the Soul King system to be corrupt, so rather than be complicit in it, he aspires to take it down, to have the courage to build a better world. This courage combined with his power and charisma is why Aizen is such an iconic villain. He's an evil genius that uses duplicity and betrayal to commit genocide and war, but his evil is motivated by something we can fundamentally relate to, a desire to live in a world that's better than the status quo. And he reinforces this humanism with his unwavering self-confidence, always believing in his own abilities as a practice of his belief in the power of free will. This, among all else, is precisely why he's Bleach's best villain. This is why Sosuke Aizen is a humanistic villain. But now I'd like to hear what you think. What are your thoughts on Aizen's character? How would you describe his role as a villain? How does he compare to other villains? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Bleach's art style. In that video, I analyze Bleach's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.